Well, let's start with the good, and then we'll
Look, I don't really want to say there's good or bad. It really depends on the individual ingredient.
And the quantity.
And also how effective they are. Because, preservatives, different products will require different preservatives. Some preservatives need different pH levels. So that's affecting, the product.
Yeah.
So you've got to pick what's right. Some are naturally derived, some or can be called naturally derived. Well, they can look not necessarily naturally derived. There are some naturally derived. There are some that are more synthetically derived. One isn't necessarily better than the other. Sometimes the more natural derived ones can be more irritating. There are some preservatives that are food grade preservatives that are found in food. Doesn't mean very much, to be honest with you. I think that, it is way more important to have a good preservative system in a skincare product. You need a good preservative system in a skincare product because that is going to protect from microbial contamination. Any brand that is promoting preservative-free, I believe, is misleading the consumer because a product has to go through preservative testing. It has to be tested for microbes. You have to have ingredients in there that are going to protect from microbial contamination. So there may be newer ingredients out there that may not be classified as a traditional preservative, but they are still having an antimicrobial action. So they still present the same amount of potential irritation that a preservative system could. So I do think, promoting things as preservative-free or saying preservatives are bad, if a skin professional is doing that, I think that is almost malpractice to be scaring a consumer against the use of preservatives in skincare.
Yeah. Without naming names, are there any brands that say that they are?
There are brands that do say preservative-free, but
really?
they do use ingredients that are having a preservative-type action.
Right.
So, and again, quite often it might mean higher amounts of these ingredients that actually have even more of an irritation to the skin. Even something like propylene glycol can have a preservative boosting function, and then even high amounts of alcohol will also have a slight preservative action. So you can get round saying preservative free by using ingredients that are antimicrobial but may not be classified as being called a traditional preservative. So it's all absolute marketing rubbish, to be honest with you.
Wow. So like honey, sugar, salt, would they be classified as preservatives?
Not necessarily.
No.
I mean, in food, maybe.
In food, yeah. What about pegs? Yes. Pegs.
Great question. Pegs get a bad rap, and I remember years ago someone coming up going, "Oh my God, you're recommending products with pegs in them," and I'm like, "What's wrong with pegs?" And most people don't even know what they are, and usually pegs are added to skincare to have more of a conditioning benefit. They can have sort of derivatives, polyethylene glycol. The issue that people have with pegs is that pegs can produce a chemical compound called 1,4-dioxane, which has been linked to being carcinogenic. Now, that's all very, very scary, but that's why people say, "Oh my God, don't use pegs." But the reality is 1,4-dioxane is a carcinogen, and therefore we're not allowed to have high amounts of it in a skincare product. So it is not allowed in carcinogenic amounts in skincare. In fact, it has to be proven and removed from a skincare product. It's a minute amount that would be allowed to be in, which would not be having a carcinogenic effect.
Right.
So it's not really relevant. The 1,4-dioxane argument isn't relevant in skincare. So again, this is where it all gets, taken out of context and people scaremonger over it. It's again just more marketing.
Right. Mineral oils?
Again, look, with mineral oil is an inert substance. It's completely non-allergenic. People aren't going to have a reaction to mineral oil.
It's like a filler, isn't it?
It's not even a filler. It's a cheap moisturizer or an emollient. So instead of using a plant oil which can oxidize and go rancid, mineral oil is a cheaper alternative. It's a lot more stable in a product because it doesn't oxidize, and people don't have reactions to it. But it is cheap. If you were using it in high amounts, could it potentially be comedogenic? People have claimed that it is, but I think it's been misproven because the molecule's too large to get into the skin.
Right.
It is a synthetic sort of ingredient. It is purified, so there's no toxins, as a clean beauty person may say there is, because it's all been purified for cosmetic use. So it's an inert substance. There's nothing wrong with it. It's not the most glamorous ingredient, but, you know.
What oil would you say is one of the best oils in skincare?
Look, it depends on why you're using it. Quite often it'll be a combination of oils. Some oils are more prone to rancidity than others, so that's something that you've got to be aware of. I mean, jojoba is technically, I think, classified even as a wax, so that's not prone to so much rancidity, so that's a great oil. There's also camellia oil, they're great oils. It depends on what you want from an oil. Some plant oils can be more comedogenic than some other oils. So again, it depends what the product is, how much oil it requires. I'm not a lover of coconut oil, but you can have extracts from the coconut oil that aren't comedogenic. You could have small amounts of coconut oil in a product. That's not a problem, but just pure neat coconut oil on an oily skin wouldn't probably be the best option, but nobody's really doing that.
So, and what about things like colouring?
Yeah.
Colouring.
Well, look, colouring makes a product look pretty. That's really the only function. There's no function or benefit for the skin. Different colours can be more comedogenic than others, but it ultimately depends on how much of that colouring agent is in the product and what other potential comedogenic or irritating ingredients are in there as well. So again, there was a lot of scaremongering about colours many years ago, and we now know that probably you would have to have a very high percentage and a lot of heavily pigmented colour in a product for it to be comedogenic, and that was a concern. I take it on a case-by-case basis. Sometimes I'll use a makeup, for instance, with colour in it. It's also got myristates in there and other ingredients, and that combination may cause breakouts on the skin. But ultimately, it depends on the percentage of that ingredient and what else it's mixed with as to whether it's going to have a negative effect on the skin or not.
Right. Sodium hydroxide,
alkalizing agent. It's not, you're not going to put that. It would be used in a minute amount as a pH adjuster in a skincare product, because if you need to put the pH up or down, you need to use something that's either strong alkali or strong acid, and that's why those ingredients would be used. But they're not going to be used in a high percentage to have a negative effect on the skin. They usually put in there to adjust the pH of a product.
Right. Emulsifiers, what about?
That's a minefield. Emulsifiers you find in pretty much every single skincare product, either as a surfactant in a cleanser or as an emulsifier to bind oil and water in a moisturizer. There's all different types. Some are stronger, some are weaker. Some can be a little irritating on the skin, and others can actually help to reinforce barrier function. So you can actually choose the right emulsifier for the right skin type, really, and it ultimately comes down to the individual brands and the emulsification systems that they use. To say emulsifiers are bad would be misinformation, because that, again, brands out there saying, emulsifier-free, but they actually do use emulsifiers, like lecithin is an emulsifier. So I think it's important to know some emulsifying systems may be a little drying on the skin or increase transepidermal water loss, and some can actually enhance skin barrier function. So it's using a brand that is going to be all about skin barrier and hydration rather than using maybe a cheap emulsification or cheap surfactant system that hasn't got all the additional hydration and emollient systems in there to support barrier function.
Right. So the emulsifier makes the soapy feel, isn't it?
That's usually the surfactant. So the surfactants are usually found in cleansers, but sometimes in a skin product as well. Soaps are different, but you're talking more cleansing products.
Shampoo?
Yep, so you would have a surfactant in there. Emulsifiers tend to be more in a moisturiser.
I see.
Some surfactants foam, but not all surfactants foam.
Right. So it's if you think, oh well, my product doesn't foam, it doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't have a...
No, and that's where people associate more foam with more cleansing, and that's not necessarily the case.
Right.
Sodium lauryl sulfate is probably one of the best known surfactants, which kind of comes under an emulsifier, if you like, but.
Okay.
When it's used in a moisturiser, it's called an emulsifier because it's an emulsion.
Right.
And when it's in a cleanser, it's called a surfactant. Sodium lauryl sulfate gets a bad rap because it's what we call an anionic surfactant. So it's a very strong surfactant. So it has a very powerful cleaning action. But if that's all you use, and you use a high amount, and you don't balance it out with conditioning agents, and you don't have other more gentle surfactants, they call it amphoteric, and you could use different types of surfactants to balance it all out, and a non-ionic, then it could be quite drying.
Yeah.
But if you used a small amount of sodium lauryl sulfate with a non-ionic, an amphoteric, a conditioning agent, a PEG, hydrating ingredients, you could have a very gentle cleanser. So just by looking at the ingredient in there can be quite misleading. You could have more gentle surfactants in higher amounts without the conditioning ingredients that could be more drying than an ingredient with sodium lauryl sulfate. So ultimately, again, it depends on the percentage used and the other ingredients that are in there as to whether it's going to be drying or not drying on the skin.
Well, silicone, I don't think we've talked about silicone, did we?
Yeah, so silicones get a bad rap. A lot of companies sort of were scaremongering on silicones and saying they were comedogenic and causing breakouts. That's since been disproven that silicones are not in any way comedogenic. The molecule of a silicone is way too large to actually get into the follicle and cause irritation. So they're not comedogenic. That's been disproven. Silicones are actually sort of a semi-occlusive that are wonderful for supporting skin barrier function, so much so that they're used a lot in the medical profession. They'll use them on scars to help with healing and recovery time. I actually now love silicones to help to support the skin barrier. They're completely inert and non-sensitizing, so people just don't have sensitivity to silicones. They're not irritating in any way.
Right.
I think with clean beauty, where they do get the bad rap is that some silicones have been proven to be not so beneficial to the environment, and there's environmental issues, a little bit like the microbeads. That being said, now there's bans on these. There's lots and lots of different types of silicones. There's volatile silicones, the ones that evaporate into the atmosphere, and then ones that just sort of sit on the skin. The ones that seem to be problematic, there's now regulations on their use. They can't be used in wash-off products because of the potential detrimental effect to the environment. I think it's silicones D4, D5 and D6 now. There's limitations.
Right.
And so again, it's not so much of an issue really, because we don't tend to use them now.
Visit our website to claim your free trial pack or schedule a consultation or in-salon demonstration.